There are places in this world where the ocean keeps secrets that should have never surfaced. Places where the wind carries echoes of voices that were never heard. And there are stories that begin with a light going out and end with 3 men disappearing without a trace. December 1900. The Flannan Isles, Scotland. A solitary lighthouse stopped shining. And when they finally arrived to investigate, they found no bodies, no struggle. They found nothing. 3 experienced men, guardians of the sea, swallowed by silence. And to this day, no one knows what truly happened there. Today, I'm going to try to find that answer. Though I know it may not exist. The ferry cuts through the gray water of the North Atlantic like a rusted knife slicing through old flesh. The wind carries the smell of salt and something deeper, something I can't name. Around me, the local passengers avoid looking toward where I'm headed. When I mentioned the Flannan Isles at the port in Lewis, an elderly woman told me something that still echoes in my head. She said, "That place doesn't belong to the living. It never did." Now, standing on the bow of the boat, watching the dark silhouettes of the cliffs appear on the horizon, I understand what she meant. The Flannan Isles aren't just remote. They're hostile. Forbidding. 7 volcanic rock islets, battered by waves that can reach 20 meters in height, surrounded by treacherous currents that have sunk dozens of ships over the centuries. Here, more than 30 kilometers off the coast of the Outer Hebrides, the modern world has no power. Here, nature still commands. And here is where 3 men cease to exist. The air is thick with moisture. The sound of the engine is a dull, mechanical heartbeat against the vastness of the ocean. I feel the cold seeping through my jacket, finding its way into my bones. The cliffs rise ahead like broken teeth, jagged and unforgiving. The water below churns white with foam, angry and relentless. There's a feeling here, a weight that presses down on your chest that makes it harder to breathe. It's not fear exactly. It's something older. Something primal. The feeling that you're being watched by something that has no eyes. It was 1899 when they built the lighthouse on Eilean Mor, the largest island in the archipelago. Eilean Mor means big island in Gaelic, though it's not big at all. It's just less small than the others. The lighthouse had a simple mission: save lives. Because these waters were known as the graveyard of ships. Every year, dozens of vessels wrecked on these invisible rocks, swallowed by fog and by currents that seemed to have a life of their own. So the Flannan Lighthouse was built with the best technology of the era. A tower 23 meters high with a light capable of reaching 40 kilometers in distance. 3 keepers lived there in rotating shifts, 6 weeks at the lighthouse, 2 weeks on land. It was hard work, lonely, brutal. But it was stable. And in a region where poverty bit with iron teeth, a stable job was worth any sacrifice. The 3 men assigned to that fateful shift were veterans. James Ducat, the principal keeper, was 43 years old with 22 years of experience in lighthouses. He was respected, meticulous, responsible. He had served in some of Scotland's most dangerous lighthouses without a single incident. Thomas Marshall, second in command, was 28 and known for his calm temperament. He had been an occasional lighthouse keeper in several places before being permanently assigned to Flannan. And finally, Donald McArthur, the occasional keeper, 40 years old, hired temporarily to replace William Ross, who had requested sick leave. MacArthur had a reputation for being more temperamental than his companions, but he was competent. There had never been formal complaints about him. These 3 men arrived at the lighthouse on December 7, 1900. 12 days later, the world would forget them forever. But what happened between those days? What did they see? What did they hear in those final hours before the silence took them? That's what no one can answer. That's what haunts this place still. On December 15th, the steamer Arch tore past in front of the Flannan Isles during a violent storm. The captain noticed something strange. The lighthouse light was off. In the middle of the storm, with waves pounding the hull and the wind howling like a wounded beast, there was no light guiding his way. The captain noted it in his log, but he couldn't stop. The conditions were too dangerous. He assumed it was a temporary technical problem. Maybe a broken glass. Maybe the lamps needed maintenance. There was no reason to be alarmed. Not yet. But when he arrived at port in Leith 4 days later, he reported the incident to the lighthouse authorities. And so began the countdown to discovery. The relief ship, the Hesperus, should have arrived on December 20th. But the weather in December in the Hebrides is unforgiving. For 6 days, violent storms made landing impossible. Giant waves broke against the docks with the force of a runaway train. The wind blew so violently it tore clothing from sailors. There was no way to approach the island. So they waited. And waited. Until finally, on December 26th, Boxing Day, the sea calmed enough to attempt landing. Joseph Moore was the first to step off the boat. He was the relief lighthouse keeper, the man who came to relieve one of the three keepers. But when his foot touched the stone dock, he knew immediately that something was wrong. There was no flag raised on the pole. That was a severe violation of protocol. The flag should always be raised during the day. There were no signs of life. No movement. No sound. Only the wind and the seagulls screaming like tortured souls. Moore walked toward the main door of the lighthouse. It was closed. He knocked. No one answered. He shouted the keepers' names. James, Thomas, Donald. Only the echo of his own voice called back to him. He felt a knot in his stomach. He knew something terrible had occurred. He opened the door. What he found inside was worse than any tragedy. Because he found nothing. The entrance door was closed from the inside but not locked. The kitchen was clean. The dishes washed and carefully stacked. The lighthouse lamps were full of fuel, clean, ready to light. Everything was in order. Too much in order. Moore climbed to the keeper's quarters. The beds were unmade. The wall clock had stopped. A chair was tipped over on the floor as if someone had stood up abruptly. And on the coat rack by the door, two thick oilskin raincoats hung, the type of coat no lighthouse keeper would leave behind if they had to go out in the middle of a storm. But there was space for a third. The third raincoat wasn't there. That meant one of the men had gone out, without protection. Or worse, had gone out knowing he wouldn't return. Moore searched the entire building. The lighthouse tower. The storerooms. The upstairs rooms. Nothing. The three men had vanished. There were no signs of struggle. No blood. No farewell notes. Only absence. Moore ran out toward the dock, shouting toward the Hesperus. They're missing. All three. There's no one here. Captain James Harvey immediately descended along with other sailors. They searched every corner of the island. They checked the cliffs, the caves, the paths. Nothing. It was as if the three men had evaporated into the air. If you've ever felt that same silence, the silence that screams louder than any voice, type the word silence below. And if you want to join me for the rest of this story and others like it, subscribe, because what comes next is even darker. The official investigation began immediately. Robert Muirhead, superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Commissioners, personally arrived on the island on December 29th. What he found disturbed him deeply. First, he confirmed the state of the lighthouse. Everything functioned perfectly. The lamps were clean and full. The rotation mechanism was in perfect condition. There were no technical failures. Nothing to justify why the light had gone out. That ruled out any theory of malfunction. Then he reviewed the logbook, the daily record where the keepers noted the weather, tasks performed, and any incidents. That's where everything became stranger. The last entry had been made on December 15th at 9 in the morning, written by James Ducat. It said simply, "Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all." It was an odd note, too religious for Ducat's usual style, who always wrote technical and direct entries. But what truly unsettled Muirhead was the date. December 15th. That was the last time anyone wrote anything in that lighthouse. And that was the same date the Archtor noticed the light was off. That meant something had occurred that day. Something so fast, so violent, that the three men didn't have time to write another word. Muirhead ordered an exhaustive inspection of the island's exterior. And that's where they found the first physical clues. At the west landing, more than 30 meters above sea level, there were signs of severe damage. A wooden box for storing ropes and equipment, secured with iron bolts at a height of 33 meters above the ocean, had been completely destroyed. The iron rails running along the edge of the landing had been torn from the concrete. A massive rock, weighing more than a ton, had been displaced from its original position. And most disturbing, more than 60 meters above sea level in a grassy area far from the cliff edge, they found soil and grass torn away, as if something with monstrous force had struck that place from below. The official conclusion was clear: a giant wave. A wave so massive, so powerful, that it had climbed more than 60 meters up the cliffs and dragged the three men into the sea. The theory said that probably two of them were outside, inspecting damage caused by a previous storm, when a giant wave surprised them. The third, seeing them in danger, ran out without his raincoat to try to rescue them, and was dragged away as well. End of mystery. Case closed. But there was a problem. A huge problem no one wanted to admit. There was no storm. According to meteorological records of the time, consulted years later by researchers, there were no severe storms in the Flannan Isles region between December 12 and December 15, 1900. The weather was bad, yes. Strong winds, moderate waves. but nothing comparable to what was necessary to generate a wave capable of climbing 60 meters up a vertical cliff and tearing away ton-weight rocks. Those waves exist, yes. They're called rogue waves, or freak waves. They appear without warning, even in relatively calm seas, and can reach heights of more than 30 meters. But for such a wave to climb 60 meters more up a cliff, the conditions have to be perfect. Or rather, they have to be catastrophic. And there was no evidence of that. So what really happened? I walked to the West Landing. It's a terrifying place even on a calm day. The ocean crashes against the rocks with a dull sound that seems to come from inside the earth. There are underwater caves beneath the landing, natural tunnels carved by thousands of years of erosion. When the sea rises, water enters those caves violently, compressing the air inside. And when the air has nowhere to go, it explodes upward. Like a geyser. Like a column of water and foam that can reach impossible heights in a matter of seconds. The locals call it the devil's breath. I stood at the edge of the landing looking down. 60 meters of vertical drop. Sharp black rocks like knives waiting at the bottom. And I thought about James Ducat, about Thomas Marshall, about Donald McArthur. I thought about them standing exactly where I was now. Maybe seeing something approaching from the horizon. Maybe feeling the ground tremble beneath their feet. Maybe hearing a roar coming from the depths. And then, nothing. Only water. Only cold. Only silence. What came next would test everything I thought I knew. Because the more I investigated, the more questions arose. And none had answers. If this story has gripped you so far, consider subscribing. The journey only gets deeper from here. Over time, theories began to proliferate. Some were reasonable. Others were absurd. But all tried to explain the inexplicable. The official theory, the giant wave, made sense, to a point. But it didn't explain everything. It didn't explain why two experienced men would have left the lighthouse without their raincoats in dangerous conditions. Ducat and Marshall had worked in lighthouses for decades. They knew the sea better than most sailors. They knew that never, under any circumstances, should you go out without proper protection. So why did they do it? One theory suggested that one of them had gone out first, perhaps for a minor emergency like securing loose equipment. The second went after him when he noticed he was taking too long. And the third, seeing that neither returned, ran out without thinking, without his raincoat, only guided by the instinct to help. And at that moment the wave arrived. That would explain the two raincoats hanging and the third absent. But one question still remained. Why was the door closed from the inside? If the third man ran out, who closed the door behind him? Another theory, darker, suggested it wasn't the sea that killed them. It was one of them. McArthur had a reputation for being temperamental. In his work file there was a note saying he had been too emotional in stressful situations. Some investigators speculated that perhaps there was a fight. Maybe McArthur lost control. Maybe he killed Ducat and Marshall in a fit of rage, and then, tormented by what he had done, threw himself into the sea from the cliff. That would explain the absence of all three bodies. But it didn't explain the massive damage at the landing. It didn't explain the destroyed box, the torn rails, the displaced rock. Those signs were of brute force, of natural violence, not human. Then there were the more unusual theories. Locals spoke of the Phantom of the Seven Hunters, a Gaelic legend about spirits that have inhabited the Flannan Isles since ancient times. According to legend, 7 hunters landed on the island centuries ago, seeking refuge during a storm. They never returned. Since then, it's said their souls roamed the rocks, luring the living toward the sea. It's just a legend, of course. But when you're standing in the middle of an island where 3 men disappeared without a trace, legends start to sound less absurd. Another theory spoke of foreign spies. In 1900, Europe was on the brink of war. Some suggested that agents from a foreign power had kidnapped the keepers to sabotage the lighthouse. But there was no evidence of that. No ships reported in the area. No motive. And frankly, it made no sense. Theories about sea serpents also emerged. Yes, you read that right. At that time, sensationalist newspapers published stories about giant sea creatures, prehistoric reptiles supposedly still inhabiting the depths of the Atlantic. Some speculated that one of these creatures had emerged from the ocean and devoured the keepers. It's ridiculous, I know. But it reflects something important. The human desperation to find an explanation, any explanation, in the face of the incomprehensible. Because what truly terrifies us isn't death. It's disappearance without cause. It's not knowing. And then there was the theory of collective suicide. Some suggested that the 3 men, overwhelmed by loneliness and isolation, had decided to end their lives together, throwing themselves into the sea. But that didn't fit with their personalities. Ducat was a family man with 4 children waiting for him at home. Marshall was engaged, planning to marry in the spring. McArthur, though temperamental, had never shown signs of severe depression. There were no suicide notes. No signs of desperation in the logbook. Everything indicated that, until the last moment, the 3 men were performing their duty normally. So what's left? What remains is the most terrifying possibility of all, that there is no explanation. That sometimes the sea simply takes what it wants, without reason, without justice, without leaving a trace. That the ocean is older, more powerful, and more cruel than we can ever understand. And that 3 men in the wrong place at the wrong time simply ceased to exist. The wind picked up. I felt it pushing against my back as if trying to shove me toward the edge. The waves below roared with a sound that was almost like laughter. I stepped back, and I wondered, did they hear that same laughter in their final seconds? Did they know what was coming? Or was it so sudden they didn't even have time to be afraid? I spent my last night on the island camping near the lighthouse. The wind howled through the rocks with a sound that seemed almost human. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and looked out toward the ocean. The waves pounded the cliffs with a hypnotic, constant, eternal rhythm. And I thought about the last moments of those 3 men. I thought about what they must have felt when they saw the wave approaching. I thought about the terror, about the desperate instinct to run, to scream, to hold on to something, to anything. I thought about the cold of the Atlantic water, which at that temperature can kill you in less than 10 minutes from hypothermia. I thought about their families waiting on land, not knowing they would never see them again. I thought about how Ducat's wife received the news. About how MacArthur's children asked for their father, not understanding why he wasn't coming back. I thought about Marshall, who never got to marry, whose fiancée wept over an empty grave. And I thought about the silence. That silence that swallowed them. Because that's what really happened here. It wasn't the wave, it wasn't the storm, it wasn't a fight or suicide or a sea monster. It was the silence. The same silence that has existed since the beginning of the world, waiting patiently to reclaim all those who dare to challenge it. The lighthouse was automated in 1971. There are no more keepers. No more men living on this lonely rock, facing the ocean with nothing more than a lamp in their will. Now machines do the work. Cold, efficient, immortal. They don't feel fear. They don't feel loneliness. They don't disappear. But the echoes of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur are still here. I feel them every time the wind blows. I hear them every time the waves strike the rocks. I see them in every shadow that crosses the lighthouse at sunset. They're not dead. Not exactly. Because to be dead, you first have to leave a body. And they left nothing. Only questions. Only mystery. Only silence. The stars were invisible that night. Thick clouds covered everything, pressing down like a weight. I could hear the sea breathing in and out, a rhythm older than memory. And somewhere in that rhythm I thought I heard voices. Faint. Distant. Calling from beneath the waves. Or maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was just my mind, desperate to find meaning where there is none. But I heard it. And I'll carry that sound with me for the rest of my life. I rose before dawn and walked to the west landing one last time. I stood in the same place where I believe they stood. The ocean was calm, almost placid. It's strange how the sea can be so beautiful and so lethal at the same time. I wondered if they also thought that in their last seconds. If they had time to think anything. Or if it was so fast they didn't even realize what was happening. There's something deeply unjust in that. In disappearing without knowing why. Without being able to say goodbye. Without leaving a final word. The ferry returned for me at noon. As the island receded on the horizon, I stayed at the stern, watching the lighthouse until it became a barely visible white dot. And I knew with absolute certainty that I will never know what really happened there. No one will. That is the curse of the Flannan Isles. It's not the mystery itself. It's knowing the mystery will never be solved. That for all eternity those 3 men will remain trapped in that last moment, that last second before everything went black. And we, the living, can only speculate, theorize, imagine. But we will never know. Never. So what do you think? Would you take this journey knowing what I know now? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, subscribe to join me on the next one. Until then, stay curious, stay brave, and never stop seeking the truth. Though sometimes the truth is only silence.